Imagine this. It's 1850, and the United States is on fire. Not with actual cannons, at least not yet, but with pure rage and political fury. We're talking about a moment so tense that pistols were nearly drawn on the floor of the Senate, and the country was teetering on the absolute edge of collapse. This is the story of the desperate, messy, last-ditch deal that tried to pull it all back from the brink.
You know, the great writer Ralph Waldo Emerson basically saw all of this coming. After the U.S. won the Mexican-American War, he wrote these chillingly prophetic words, "Mexico will poison us." Now, he wasn't talking about a literal poison, of course. He was talking about a political one. He knew that the vast new lands the U.S. had just won would unleash a firestorm over slavery that could very well destroy the nation.
And boy, was Emerson right. That victory came with what you could call a poisoned prize, a massive chunk of territory we know as the Mexican Cession. All of a sudden, that question that had been bubbling just under the surface for decades, would new American land be slave or free? Well, it boiled over. And the answer to that question threatened to rip the Union in two.
And just think about how fast this all happened. The war ends in 1848, and boom, the entire American Southwest is now part of the U.S. Then, less than a year later, somebody yells gold in California. Thousands and thousands of people pour in. The population explodes, and suddenly, California needs to become a state, way faster than anyone was ready for.
So you've got these two sides on an absolute collision course. In the North, you've got the Free Soil movement pushing something called the Wilmot Proviso, which basically said no slavery, period, in any of the new territory. But for the South, this was an existential threat. Their entire political power depended on keeping that perfect balance in the Senate. One new slave state for every new free state.
So, into this political minefield step three absolute legends of the Senate. I mean, these guys were political giants, and this was going to be their last great battle. They were called the Great Triumvirate, and pretty much the fate of the nation rested on their shoulders.
First up, you've got Henry Clay of Kentucky. He was 73 years old, an elder statesman, and they called him the Great Compromiser for a reason. He had already pulled the country back from the brink of civil war twice before. Now, he was stepping up to the plate to try and forge one last grand bargain to hold the country together.
Then there was Daniel Webster, the legendary speaker from Massachusetts. In what became his most famous speech, he basically pleaded with everyone to put the Union first. He argued for compromise, even on slavery, saying he wasn't there to speak for the North, but as an American. Let me tell you, that stance cost him big time with the anti-slavery folks back home.
And on the complete other side of the spectrum, you have John C. Calhoun of South Carolina. And what a scene this was. He was so sick with tuberculosis that he couldn't even deliver his own speech. He just sat there, wrapped in blankets, while another senator read his chilling message for him. And that message was, the South is done compromising. He believed this deal would destroy the Southern way of life and that a split was unavoidable. Just a few weeks later, he was dead.
So what was Clay's master plan to fix all of this? Well, he decided to go big or go home. He took every single thorny issue on the table, California, fugitive slaves, all of it, and bundled them into one single, massive piece of legislation. It became famous as the Omnibus Bill.
Now, an omnibus bill is a huge political gamble. The idea is that by lumping everything together, you give every side something they want, so they're forced to swallow the parts they hate. But if just one of those parts is too toxic for too many people, the whole thing comes crashing down.
And that is exactly what happened. In the summer of 1850, the Grand Plan failed spectacularly. You had this strange alliance of anti-slavery Northerners and pro-slavery Southerners who both hated the bill for different reasons, and they teamed up to kill it. Clay's big gamble had failed, Congress was deadlocked, and the country was closer to breaking apart than ever before.
Okay, so it looks like it's over, right? The compromise is dead. But just when it seems like all hope is lost, the deadlock gets broken by a combination of a total shocker of a tragedy and some really clever political strategy.
The first event was completely unexpected. President Zachary Taylor, who was firmly against Clay's compromise, suddenly got sick and died. And his vice president, Millard Fillmore, became president. Well, Fillmore had a totally different view. He wanted a deal, and he immediately threw the full power of the White House behind getting one done.
The second breakthrough came from a new, younger leader. With Henry Clay totally exhausted, this energetic senator from Illinois named Stephen Douglas stepped in. He looked at Clay's failed bill and had a brilliant insight. He realized the problem wasn't the individual proposals, it was trying to pass them all at once. So he unbundled the whole thing. He decided to pass each piece as a separate bill. That way, he could build a different coalition for each vote. It was a legislative masterstroke.
So, what was actually in this 5-part deal that Douglas so skillfully managed to get through Congress? Let's break down the individual pieces of what we now know as the Compromise of 1850.
All right, here's the breakdown. First, the North got its biggest prize. California was admitted as a free state. To balance that, the South got a new and much harsher Fugitive Slave Act. As for the new territories of New Mexico and Utah, they would get to decide the slavery question for themselves, a concept called popular sovereignty. Then, Texas gave up some of its land claims, and in return, the U.S. government paid off $10 million of its debt. And finally, the slave trade, the actual buying and selling of people, was banned in Washington, D.C.
You can see the give and take in each part of the deal, right? A delicate balancing act. But one of these 5 bills wasn't just a compromise, it was a firebomb. It would cause so much outrage in the North that it would ultimately prove this so-called truce was anything but permanent.
We're talking about the Fugitive Slave Act. This law was absolutely brutal. It forced officials and even regular citizens in free states to help capture people accused of escaping slavery. The accused themselves had basically no legal rights. No jury trial, they couldn't even testify in their own defense. And get this, the federal commissioners who made the rulings were paid $10 if they sent a person south into slavery, but only $5 if they set them free. For many Northerners, this brought the violent reality of slavery right to their doorstep.
So what was the final result of this messy, hard-fought, and really controversial deal? Was the Union actually saved? Or was the final bloody showdown just postponed?
Well, at the time, people celebrated. Crowds cheered in the streets. The Union is saved. President Fillmore himself called it a final settlement. But he was wrong. It wasn't a peace treaty. It was an armistice, just a temporary pause in the fighting.
But that pause was crucial. The compromise bought the Union 10 more years, a precious decade that allowed the North to keep industrializing, to lay more railroad tracks, and for its population to grow. And all of those advantages would prove to be absolutely decisive when the war finally did come.
Which really leaves us with the big, lingering question about this whole episode. Was this a brilliant act of statesmanship that pulled the Republic back from the abyss? Or was it just a disastrous deal that delayed the inevitable and, in doing so, maybe made the final conflict even bloodier? That's a debate that historians are still having to this day.